Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what has to be one of the greatest underdog stories in the history of extreme 19th century engineering. I mean, we all know that iconic silhouette, right? But the sheer mechanical madness, the death-defying construction, and the desperate fight for its very survival, well, that's a story that is rarely told in full. Let's get right into it.
Take a look at this stark contrast between expectation and reality. Back in 1887, this project was universally expected to be a temporary eyesore. It was quite literally scheduled to be torn down after 20 years. Yet today, it sits as the most visited monument on the entire planet. The gap between what people thought would happen and what actually happened is absolutely massive.
Okay, let's really dive into this, because the public backlash against Gustave Eiffel's vision was just incredibly fierce. The intellectual and artistic elites of Paris were absolutely horrified. They mounted this massive cultural battle, petitioning to stop the construction of what they genuinely believed would be a giant, rusting blemish. They were convinced it would completely ruin the historic, beautiful skyline of Paris.
So, that brings us to the central mystery we are solving today. How in the world did a deeply hated temporary iron lattice manage not just to stand up, but to survive multiple existential threats and become the undisputed eternal symbol of an entire nation? Make no mistake, this was a high-stakes hero's journey, and catastrophic failure was always just one tiny miscalculation away. Section 1. The Impossible Parisian Bet. Let's set the stage with our first major trial. The intense pressure here was being driven by a rapidly ticking clock. The year is 1887, and France is desperate to impress the world at the upcoming World's Fair. They're expecting a staggering 32 million visitors and facing really fierce global competition from cities like London, Chicago, and Berlin. Enter Gustave Eiffel with a wildly ambitious pitch, a 300-meter iron tower. Honestly, it was considered absolute madness. Politicians argued it was way too expensive, and top engineers seriously doubted it could even support its own weight. And to make matters even worse, Eiffel was given an impossible deadline. He had exactly 765 days to build the tallest structure on Earth. Moving on to Section 2, Conquering the Muddy Foundations. So construction kicks off in January 1887, and immediately the team hits a terrifying roadblock right beneath their feet. See this number? 7,300. That is the massive tonnage of iron that had to be supported. And the location they were building on? Right on the edge of the River Seine. The soil was completely waterlogged. It was effectively an unstable swamp that was entirely incapable of supporting over 7,000 tons of metal. To solve this, engineers essentially buried immense, pressurized steel caissons, think the size of small houses, deep down into the mud. The conditions were brutal. Workers had to dig inside these chambers where the air was 3 to 4 times denser than at the surface, and temperatures rapidly shot up to 40 degrees Celsius. Breathing was a real struggle, and coming up to the surface too fast meant risking caisson disease, which we now know as decompression sickness. This was a poorly understood condition that regularly caused paralysis or death on other industrial sites of the era. But miraculously, thanks to Eiffel's obsessive discipline and incredibly strict safety protocols, out of the over 300 workers facing these early industrial risks, there was only a single fatality throughout the entire project. Section 3. Precision, Wind, and Rivets. Now, what's really interesting about this next phase is the sheer geometric nightmare of it all. Once the caissons hit stable ground and were filled with concrete, it was time for the 4 immense legs to independently rise into the sky. Think about the scale here. You have 4 independent legs spaced 125 meters apart at the base. They all have to rise at a very specific angle and perfectly lock together exactly 57 meters in the sky to form the first floor. Even a 1 millimeter miscalculation meant the entire structure was condemned. The ingenious problem-solving here was just unprecedented. You had 50 engineers tracking a living structure. And I say living because the iron tower actually breathes. It expands up to 15 centimeters in the summer heat. Using 10 theodolites, which are basically early laser-like measuring tools, they check the angles every single day. But here's the most incredible part. Eiffel's 28-year-old lead engineer installed massive hydraulic jacks under each foot of the tower. This meant they could manually adjust and literally pump up hundreds of tons of iron to perfectly correct the tower's stance on the fly. Plus, every single piece of iron arrived from Eiffel's workshops, pre-cut and meticulously numbered. It was like a giant, high-stakes puzzle. As these massive 300 to 700 kilogram iron beams were hoisted up via hand-cranked winches, they had to be permanently bound together. To pull that off, the construction required metal heated to a glowing red temperature of 1,000 degrees Celsius.
The execution of this was practically an acrobatic act, and it was dangerously fast-paced. They worked in four-man teams. First, the chauffeur heats the rivet. Next, the lancer literally throws this glowing hot piece of metal through the air. Then, the receveur catches it in a metal funnel and slots it into the hole. Finally, the reaver violently crushes the end with a hammer to lock it into place. This entire death-defying sequence had to be flawlessly executed in under 20 seconds before the metal cooled and contracted.
Think about this. Over 2 million rivets were placed exactly this way. And remember, these workers were balancing like tightrope walkers on beams the width of a smartphone, up to 200 meters in the air, with absolutely no safety harnesses or protective eyewear. It was widely said in Paris back then that you could always recognize an Eiffel Tower riveter simply by looking at their permanently burned hands.
All right, Section 4, Cranes in the Clouds.
So, on December 7, 1887, all four legs successfully meet at the first floor. The foundation was secure. But going higher introduced completely new, deadly variables. To conquer the air above, engineers invented the first 360-degree cranes that actually climbed the structure itself. Since radio communication didn't exist yet, and the howling winds just carried voices away, the workers relied entirely on a physical rope communication system. One strong pull meant lift, 2 or 3 sharp shakes meant stop immediately. They also pioneered curved rails for the new American Otis elevators, using articulating metal joints to absorb structural shifting. This ensured the tracks wouldn't just snap as the tower swayed in the wind. And this brilliantly illustrates why Eiffel was a total master of his craft. As the tower narrowed past the 115-meter second floor, he intensified the dense iron lattice, creating what became known as a cathedral of wind. Instead of fighting the heavy gales like a solid wall would, the hollow core and intricate geometry allowed severe winds to just pass harmlessly through the structure. He effectively neutralized the very force that everyone thought would tear it down.
Which brings us to our final section, Survival and Global Icon. Against all odds, on March 31, 1889, they reached the summit at over 300 meters, officially completing the build for the Exposition Universelle. Gustave Eiffel even built a secret apartment at the very top for scientific experiments. But honestly, the battle for the tower's life was really just beginning. Look at this incredible timeline. It opens in 1889 to a roaring success with 1.9 million fair visitors. But by 1909, the 20-year concession ends and the tower is slated for the scrapyard. It is saved at the absolute last minute because its extreme height made it a perfect strategic antenna for early radio transmissions. By 1914, it proves vital by intercepting German World War I signals, even catching the infamous spy Mata Hari. And incredibly, in 1944, as the Allies approach Paris, Adolf Hitler explicitly orders the tower destroyed, an order famously defied by a German general.
But beyond just surviving history, look at the financial side of things today. The initial construction cost, the equivalent of roughly 35 million euros. Today, it generates a staggering 120 million euros annually, drawing over 7 million visitors a year as the most visited monument in the world. That revenue comfortably covers the massive effort required to completely repaint the entire Iron Giant by hand every 7 years just to prevent it from rusting.
So what should you actually take away from all this? Well, a structure born from deep controversy, built on muddy swamps, and explicitly intended to be torn down, managed to defy every single expectation. It took the incredible perseverance of over 300 fearless workers and one immensely visionary engineer to transform what the elite called a hideous monster into the eternal soul of Paris. It really leaves you wondering, what modern controversial megaprojects that we harshly criticize today might just become the beloved historical icons of tomorrow? Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.